Um, Very welcome, everybody, to today's session for the Digital Support Services T-Level and for preparing for the Digital Infrastructure Occupational Specialism assignments. And the plan for today's webinar is just to begin with a few quick introductions. Then we'll have like a high-level overview of the assessment before looking at each assignment in a little bit more detail. So just to give some quick introductions. So my name's David Kiernan, and I work in the provider development team at NCFE. And our purpose, our remit, is to support you with the delivery of the T-level qualifications. So understanding the structure, teaching and learning, preparing for the assessments like today's webinar, and anything related to teaching and learning. My email address is shown, but if I'm unavailable, then please use our general email address, provider.development@ncfe.org.uk. I'm also joined today by David Seddon, who will introduce himself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the session. As David said, I'm the subject specialist for digital at NCFE. Just a little bit about me. I've been with NCFE now for around about 18 months, and prior to that I do come from a teaching background, so I worked in a large Northwest college for about the last 21 years, and in that time I was delivering and managing all the computer science programs, both in further education, higher education and apprenticeships. So coming from that kind of background, I can understand some of the problems or things you might encounter while you're going through these programs. And as far as T-levels are concerned, we was a pilot college for them, and I've been involved with the T-levels since it first started development. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for that. One other thing just to mention here, neither myself nor David are part of the assessment team or have had any involvement with the occupational specialism assignments. We couldn't then speak to you if we had, as that would be a conflict of interest. But hopefully this is still going to be very useful in terms of helping to prepare you for what to expect. So we're going to have a look at an overview of the assessment first, even including like the marking and grading sort of aspects of it. So you're probably very familiar already with the Digital Support Services qual page. And there is one resource on there which is quite easy to miss that I do want to point out. At the very bottom of the page, there are exemplification materials, and these show the pass and distinction standard of work for the sample assignment briefs that are also on QualHub. So it is well worth looking at those, as they do also contain examiner comments, so mentioning what's some of the positives and areas for development. As well as that, key area to look at is definitely in the specification and the resources section. So letting you know the resources you need in order to deliver this occupational specialism. And when it comes to the assignments as well, there will be a provider guide that will be provided to yourselves to let you know things such as specific resources needed for that assignment, but it should remain relatively similar to the sample that we have on QualHub. Now, the digital infrastructure assignments are going to assess the 3 performance outcomes that you will be delivering during the year. And you do need to ensure that all content is delivered before students actually sit the assessment. The weighting of each of them is shown there, but bigger emphasis is definitely on performance outcome 2, 49% overall, because regarding those skills that are shown there in that performance outcome are considered incredibly vital when working in a digital infrastructure role. If you have previously attended or watched our webinar on planning your Year 2 delivery, you'll have seen a 2-year sample plan similar to this. But just focusing in on Year 2, and as mentioned previously, you'll need to have completed delivery before the assessment. And by the end of February or beginning of March might be a good target to ensure sufficient time for revision and practice. Of course, that depends on your delivery model, the number of hours you'll have with students, any block placements planned, etc. The deadline for registering students onto the assessment is the 6th of April, and it's best to do that soon if you haven't done so already to ensure you don't get late fees. Another reason is so that you can access assignments 2 and 3, which are released for providers' eyes only on the 31st of March. and you won't be able to get the assignments unless students are registered. Now, just in terms of an overview of each assignment, we will look at each one in depth. The delivery is very similar to the employer STEP project, where assignments are completed under supervised conditions. Students can only have access to the assessment material during those sessions, and evidence then submitted to NCFE for marking. And students are going to take on a digital infrastructure role and complete various tasks, and they've all been designed to be as occupationally realistic as possible, with input from educators, employers, and industry experts. Now, just currently, the plan for this delivery, and the reason I'm saying currently is because we do annual reviews, take on provider feedback, is that in the first week is when the assignment will be conducted, and this is usually mid-April, where we're looking at mid-April each year. And this first assignment is always going to involve planning, preparation, and infrastructure design. This is conducted on days set by NCFE. And assignment 2 is during a 1-week window, and this is in sessions scheduled by yourselves, by the providers. And this is about testing configurations, installations. And then the final assignment is an evaluation of the security of the network. And that's during the 3rd week on dates set by NCFE. So in total, 3-week period for delivery. Now, there will be changes to our key date schedule in light of the King's coronation and the resulting bank holiday, so do make sure you refer to and look out for that update. Now, this table shows the intended weighting of each assignment and the number of marks that's actually available as well. And you might see there is a bit of a problem here where the weighting of the assignment doesn't match the actual marks available. Now, it's not always possible for us to just increase the number of marks available. Otherwise, the assessment might become very overly prescriptive and wouldn't be as valid or reliable. So instead, and you may have seen this in the specification, a scaling factor is used. And this is a number that's multiplied by the raw marks to produce something called a scaled mark. And it's this scaled mark that we look at. So here's the scaling factors, the number that is multiplied by the raw mark, and then we can see how that changes the scaled mark we have. So if we look at assignment 2, 53 raw marks available, but applying the scaling factor, multiplying by that number, 76. And now our weightings actually match what we wanted the assignments. That's probably easier just to look at how this would work in terms of grading. So the assignments are graded past merit and distinction. And the very first sitting is the first time they have been sat. So there's no previous grade boundaries. So these ones, not based on any real data, just illustrative purposes only. And the marks for each assignment get aggregated into a final mark using a linear aggregation mechanism, in which the scaled marks, they are combined, the scaled ones, to determine the overall scaled mark needed to achieve a grade. So it's scaled marks that we are considering. And it's probably easier just to look at this with some students. So here we have grades and marks achieved by 3 students in the 3 assignments. And for every student, whatever their raw mark achieved is, that's multiplied by the scaling factor. And we keep it to 3 decimal places before adding all those scaled marks together and rounding to the nearest to find out what their total scaled mark is. And it's this scaled mark that's compared to the grade boundaries. So not their raw mark, whatever their scaled mark is. And when it comes to their final grade, when all the assessments have been completed, it is a 50-50 split in terms of the weighting between the core component and the occupational specialism. So if students got a B in the core and a merit in the occupational specialism, their final grade would be a merit. And resits are permitted and they're unlimited, and it is the best grade that counts, although students only have 2 years after completing the T level to do any resits. And in terms of after you get the results, do remember we do have our post-results service if you need to do any checks, review of marking, appeals, etc. So that was just, as I mentioned, just a quick high-level overview. And we'll now look in detail a bit more at assignment 1. So the first assignment that students are going to face is always going to be about planning and infrastructure design. Now, this assignment has got 3 tasks, each of which does occur on a day which is set by NCFE. Now, in the first task, students will need to plan for a network installation, and they'll have 3 hours for this task. We'll look in a little bit more detail at the specifics. The second task is 5 hours, and this is delivered over an AM and PM sessions, where students need to put a proposal together for the servers and storage. And the final task is about the communication equipment and any of those final required elements that are needed. And this is 5 hours in total, and this is delivered as well with a morning and afternoon session. So in terms of task 1 and the assignment, the scenario is going to change each year, different sector or business with its own set of requirements. But for task 1, students will always be planning a network for a building, for a floor, something like that. So they'll be identifying activities and timeframes for a project plan, which they'll also need to produce. So they will need an appropriate project management tool or software. And students will also need to detail any of the legal requirements when it comes to like data processing and storage and the handling of equipment. And finally, they also need to think about security measures for the network and for the building. Now, there will be an NCFE provided workbook for students to complete with relevant headings, and the version that you will receive will be in an editable format. And you will receive information regarding resources, as I mentioned, in the live provider guide. Do always check that, but they should remain relatively the same as what I've mentioned on here. Now, as internet access is not permitted for task 1, if there is any online versions or tools that you would usually use, you do have to make sure that anything like that is also available offline, since they won't be able to access it online. Now, when it comes to the students actually being assessed, you will find the descriptors in the sample mark scheme. But what I've tried to do here is just summarize it a bit better for you. So this task is assessing performance outcomes 1 and 2, and just focusing on performance outcome 2. So students should mark the physical countermeasures, focusing on performance outcome 1, excuse me, performance outcome 2. On performance outcome 1, students should mark those physical countermeasures on the floor plan. And they should show quite good thought for where they've actually placed them and the impact that placement would have. So marking CCTV cameras, for example, and then the justifications, such as the placement will capture everyone who enters or leaves the building. So given those justifications. And their supporting documents are also assessed. They're assessed for the exploration they've done of the physical and digital vulnerabilities, with countermeasures suggested as well for those vulnerabilities, and how suitable those countermeasures are as well. And then for a performance outcome 2, their project plan and Gantt chart should have suitable activities that are chosen, which will address all the requirements and information that's been given in the task, suitable timelines within there as well, and all completed within the time frame that has been asked for as well on the brief. So their account should include like the relevant stages of a solution lifecycle, so planning, testing, pre-production, and cover data security and working safely as well, with those relevant laws, standards, and practices referenced to those 2. So we'll explore some different activities to help prepare students. Just in terms of the business control techniques, you could have students try and design their own floor plan and layout with specific vulnerabilities, have them swap and see if they can spot them. Now, and also as the brief scenario is going to change, rather than really the task activity, it's good to get them practicing different scenarios or thinking about different industries. You know, health, for example, more maybe wearing ID badges more visible, or even card readers, keypad entry for certain rooms where medicines and so on are kept. Whereas retail, like a clothes shop, might just be a uniform rather than needing card reader badges, regular key and lock sort of doors, since there's no medicines or controlled substances. So thinking about those, or even get more creative, Jurassic Park might need some very specialist locks for that scenario. And again, have students come up with these scenarios to save you having to write them. Or adapt things from other resources we have. So network cabling, for example, assignment 1 is also about planning for a network installation. And there's also a room layout and so on there too. So it could be adapted for that. Or even, and as well as that, the exemplification materials too for that assignment could be adapted. So showing students the pass one and having them rate it, and then showing them the distinction one. Of course, you can do that, of course, with digital infrastructure, exemplification materials too. I'm just trying to think of ways to save you those and utilize extra resources too. David Seddon now has got a few extra bits of advice for this task.
Yeah, I mean, that first task, it's all about project planning. So it's obviously about making sure students are quite comfortable with timescales it takes for doing things, but also looking at the correct order that things are done in. You know, they're given a lot of information when they start reading that brief, and it's, can they interpret the information? Can they look at the realistic timescales and look at the order that they should putting them things in? As David had said with the floor plans, use your college or your sixth form. You know, have the students look around your classrooms or the floor you're working on or your department or whichever way you work, and get them to plan it out, measure out the floor, look at where your doors are, where you put cameras in, that's what physical measures, physical security you'd implement, how you'd secure the place down. So it's getting them used to measuring it up and working with it, and they can draw their own floor plans up from that. You know, I think half the battle really is taking the work away from yourself in coming up with these plans. So by having students going around and measure it, it works that way. And I know it's not always easy to get guest speakers in, but using guest speakers from your own school or college, IT departments coming in and talking about maybe how they work with capital bids and how they structure things for putting a lab together, or what would be involved if they come to put a lab together for you. Or if you've got your own estates teams, seeing if the estate teams will come in and talk through maybe a capital bid process, and they can then look at where the legal requirements are on that side. You know, at least using people from your own college gives you the chance to pick their brains. It brings somebody in who's doing it day in, day out from industry, and it's saving bringing in guest speakers from other places. Thanks, David.
Yes, thank you very much for that. So the second task, students will create a technical proposal for the servers, roles, storage, and operating systems that meet the requirements of the brief. So given a bit of summary on this slide, so it should include information on the roles and applications the business will need as well on the servers. So again, focusing on the requirements of the brief, hardware and software requirements, and their approach to architecting the servers, so physical or virtual, for examples, and equipment requirements, suggested vendors. So students will need to provide justifications, definitely, to get the higher marks, making those choices and justifications. And internet access is permitted for the purposes of research, and it should only be for the purposes in the brief. So that is for performing those research, going on to manufacturers' websites, looking up specifications, things like that. So privacy mode should be disabled, and a copy of their browsing history is also submitted. And for this, students also need to produce a network diagram for the proposal. And so for this one, it will just be a screenshot. It doesn't need to be the actual like packet tracer file, for example. But obviously they will need access to an appropriate tool like packet tracer to do that network diagram. And like with task one, I've just tried to summarize the main parts of the mark scheme here for you. I'm not going to go through every single point on here, but just to highlight in performance outcome 2, that very first bullet point, to get the higher marks, students do need to consider like the wider roles and applications needed in the business, just to ensure that all essential software and roles are addressed. And then likewise with that third bullet point, also in performance outcome 2, for the server and storage specifications, this should exceed the functional and non-functional technical requirements. So their solution covers that demand for the network sort to grow. So making sure they're thinking along those ways. And then performance outcome 3 is all about the sources of information they've used. Well, thinking they're reliable, valid, any potential bias on them. Again, getting students ready for this task, the best thing again is probably going to be practice with different requirements and using the likes of Packet Tracer. And again, get students involved with this. So have them come up with their own network requirements, and they actually produce a diagram that would meet those requirements. And then swap them with their peers, see if their peers manage to do sort of the same thing. Do they come up with the same sort of network diagram that they had envisioned? So in the digital support assignment 1, there's also a screenshot show one where this task is also about network design. So on there, the screenshot that I've just done on there is also about that proposal. So thinking about timescales, the network design, and equipment, and so on. So some adaptable bits from that one too. And that got David here with some extra suggestions too.
Yeah, I know we've mentioned Packet Tracer a couple of times. You don't need Packet Tracer, but it's a good tool for using. It's nice and easy to use with students. You know, it does say in the assessment you can use Visio. There's internet access, so they could use online tools for doing the network diagramming. It's just a bit quicker in using Packet Tracer if they're doing that type of thing. And again, if anybody's not using it, there is a link at the bottom there where Open University have got the online version of it because they have got internet access for that assessment. So they could do the diagram using that as well. But even just for practicing, using Packet Tracer for getting the network put together, we don't endorse Cisco with it, so there's no requirement that the students have to be able to go in and use the routers, as in configuring it from a command line interface, but using it for maybe activities where you give the wrong IP address in, maybe you use the wrong cable, or you connect the cable to the wrong port, get them using security measures, maybe putting in servers but not setting the scope right for the DHCP, small things like that. So the troubleshooting it a lot. And if you've not tried it already, maybe having a go at using Packet Trace to create some Packet Tracer activity files. It does take a little longer setting up the activity files, but once you've configured one, you can set it up with all the instructions in it. You can allocate marks for each task that the student performs. So as they're working through it, it becomes a self-marking assessment. It does require you to use a bit of HTML when you're setting up the activity files. But again, you can always use an online editor to convert your text and write the HTML for you. If you've not had a look at doing activity files, I'll just put 2 links in the chat. One of them is just a YouTube video with somebody who takes you through setting up a Packet Tracer activity file. It uses an older version of Packet Tracer, but everything that they do in the video is transferable and easy enough to work with the latest version. And the second link I've put in the chat is just an online HTML editor. So if you do come to write your own instructions and you're not sure how to do the HTML, you can type it straight into the editor and it'll write the HTML for you. Alternatively, you could get the students to look at writing activity files. And once you've got a collection of these activity files, they become fantastic teaching tools. Thanks, David.
Cheers. Thank you, David. Our final task that students are going to be faced with is task 3. And this is about adding those remaining elements of the infrastructure to that technical proposal based, of course, on the brief requirements. And students including that rationale, that justification always. So what students will need to do is to annotate the floor plans to show the placement of these elements. And internet access is permitted again for this task, which is for the likes of like viewing manufacturers' websites, evaluating sources, and so on. So that's absolutely fine, just as long as it's for those purposes, as I said. And there is an NCFE workbook provided, which will have those relevant elements for students to add to. In terms of the mark scheme, all 3 of the performance outcomes are assessed, and we do have the descriptors for these remaining the same as we see here. So for performance outcome 1, their security considerations and approach that they take should be a good modern approach in line with the current standards. Performance outcome 2, I just want to highlight just the second bullet points here, because markers are going to rely on the students' annotations, labels on diagrams, etc., to try and visualize that approach they've taken. So do ensure that students have that very clear so it's outlined. And for this task, just in terms of preparing students, getting some comparison or research-based tasks might be useful. So let's say comparing 2 components for their functionality, advantages and disadvantages, but then even more importantly, having students suggest some maybe different organization types or scenarios where each component is more suitable. Then it might get them thinking about requirements when it comes to the live brief and just getting them thinking along those lines. Or you could do it the other way, get students used to focusing, as I mentioned, on the needs of the brief, but you could give students a component and say, try and come up with some requirements, work backwards where this would be the answer. Let's say cloud hosted server, work backwards. What do you think could be some requirements where that would be the solution? And then again, students could swap and see if they come up with the same thing. So for assignment 2 is going to consist of 2 practical tasks that students have to perform. And this assignment is in a 1-week window. And again, key date schedule, do look out for updates to account for the King's coronation. And these sessions are provider scheduled. So you schedule the sessions, and multiple sessions can be scheduled just to ensure the entire cohort, all your groups of students, can be completed. But there are some conditions to these scheduled sessions. So the assignment, once a student starts it, it has to be completed in that single day. And this will be a 3-hour morning session and a 3-hour afternoon session, during which they complete 2 tasks. And the first one is going to be a relatively short task, assessing just a particular skill from performance outcome 2. And then in task 2, students are presented with a sequence of tasks to complete, all related to digital infrastructure. So just in terms of the very first task, this one is going to be short, like 20 to 30-minute task. So it shouldn't be very time consuming, relatively speaking. And it will be assessing a particular skill from performance outcome 2. So an example there, and the one in specific example from the specification for skill 2.5, where students need to make 2 types of different cables. So it could be aspects like that. And I've put the mark scheme for this one on the slide as well. But there is one thing to say regarding this one, that there isn't a fixed set of like marking descriptors, because it is going to be dependent on what's being asked students to do in that practical task. Now, this will need annotated photographs to be submitted as evidence. Then during task 2, students are going to be presented with a series of tasks related to digital infrastructure. And this is always going to be in the form of a task sequence. But the number of steps or tasks will vary each series. And the level of demand does increase as students progress through. Now, this task has been designed to assess specific skills from performance outcomes 1 and 2. And these are skills that students will need and will relate when they actually get out there and work in industry. So for example, one part of the task sequence could ask students to assess like network administration and the integration of new hardware. And then the second part of the sequence could assess desktop deployment and optimization. So, and it has been designed so it can be delivered either physically or virtually. And there is an NCFE workbook provided for annotated screenshots to be added to. Again, I've tried to include just a general resources required, but do check the live provider guide for specifics. For example, there might be specific files that you need to have ready, maybe operating system that students might need to install as part of the task. And much like task 1, there's no set grading descriptors for this task. Again, this is due to the practical nature, and instead it's a points-based system. where students have either performed the action or they haven't. So get them, have they performed an action? Mark. Have they not done it? Then no mark. Just showing an example there in terms of operating systems. So each bullet point showing those steps clearly, they would achieve a mark. And just in terms of preparing students, especially for that short task, especially in terms of like making cables, things like that, what you could do is look at the provider guide, again, for the network cabling occupational specialism. Because assignment 3 actually requires students to examine faulty cables, and the provider guide gives some instructions on how you can make these faulty cables. So you could give these to your students, have them examine it, can they see where something might be loose, not done correctly, and then fix it themselves. Again, may not all be fully applicable to your students, but should hopefully give you a few different ideas. And I have tried to include like what a general checklist might be for a cabling skill activity. David Seddon as well got some extra advice for us.
Yeah, just for more on the second task and that. Again, they don't have to use VMs. They can use equipment if you've got it available. But probably working with VMs is easiest with the amount of equipment you'd need. Obviously, make sure students are comfortable working with VMs, installing the operating systems, how they configure the operating systems. And on most of the assessments, it'll always say, annotate, take screenshots of the process you're going through and annotate it. If you look at a lot of the comments, it's about, have they taken enough evidence that they're doing it? And as they're taking the evidence, are they talking about what they're doing technically? Are they technically accurate as they're going through it? So get them in the habit of annotating things, and as they're annotating it, being able to clearly talk through the steps they're going through. And if you use the marking schemes, they're easy enough to adapt. A lot of them, as you go through it, it's easy to see where the marks are allocated, so they can use a bit of a checklist as they're going through it. But from your perspective, it then makes them assignments easy enough to adapt, because you can easily go through it and replace the names or replace the job descriptions or the groups that they're meant to be working in. So you can go through that task multiple times just by changing some simple information within it. And again, you could get the students doing the same kind of thing. Thanks, David.
Cheers. Thank you, David. On to the very final assignment now, which is always going to be about security of the network. So this assignment consists of 4 tasks, which are conducted over 2 days, and these are on dates and times set by NCFE. So the very first task is the morning of day 1, and this is practical, where students perform a security risk assessment within the 2-hour time limit. Tasks 2 and 3 are both on the afternoon of day 1, and these ones are more paper-based than practical, where students need to make recommendations regarding security and control measures, and also make recommendations for a business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. Now, each task is to be conducted separately. So task 2 is 45 minutes, and students need to complete task 2 before they can do task 3, which is also 45 minutes. And then we have our final task, which is more practical again. And this is where students need to carry out actions to better protect the network. And this is on the second day for 2 hours. So just focusing in on task 1, students will be given the floor plan, a risk assessment template, and access to a server and client PC. And again, this can be done physically or virtually, but NCFE will be providing the VM file. And students will perform a risk assessment related to the needs in the brief, ensuring to consider physical, administrative, and technical controls. And as the majority of you, I'd imagine, will be delivering virtually, then do please ensure that the virtual network files are copied and tested as working just prior to the start of the assessment. And as for the marks and the examiners, you'll see here that students do need to cover those physical, technical, and administrative risks for performance outcome 1. And for performance outcome 3, It's about showing again that critical thinking in their security risk assessment, justifying that risk level and explaining why their control measures are actually going to be effective. Why will they work to reduce the risk? Now, the second task links into that previous one, where students need to make recommendations that could be added to a security policy document. So, for example, this could be administrative security controls that might need to be implemented to prevent customers' data from being leaked, whether that was done intentionally by someone or just done accidentally, trying to think about that. And students will add this to the NCFE provided workbook. And again, those justifications for the controls being present. And students should also explain how the controls are going to be enforced and legislation practices, ensuring that they're referenced to any of those controls where that would apply. Now, unlike some of the other grading descriptors where I've specifically said like performance outcome 1 graded descriptors, performance outcome 2, this task isn't separated out by that. It was decided that this one, a more holistic approach needed to be taken and actually worked best for marking this task. And as you can see, the first point is relevance to the scenario. And that's important throughout all the assignments. And as mentioned previously, students should state how those controls are relevant to the scenario, how they'll be enforced, and any applicable legislation. Then we have task 3, kind of follows on quite nicely from task 2, where students now need to plan what to do if an event actually happens. And this is done by making recommendations for a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan. So they're not actually writing these plans, it's just things that they think could be included. And this might be for a specific cause, such as flooding, which is in the example sample assessment. And it should adhere to the timescales that are actually mentioned in the brief as well for being able to recover or being operational once more. And in line with task 2, this one is also marked a bit more holistically. So, and examiners are looking for well-written and comprehensive recommendations. As well as that, a few appropriate examples to help give it a bit of shape to the document, help give that context, and making it very relevant to the brief as well. And then finally, we have task 4. And this is where students actually have to carry out certain actions to either harden or further protect that network. And students should take good care here when reading the brief to make sure they're addressing those requirements, what's specifically written in there. And this will require the same setup as task 1, those physical or virtual setup that you had in task 1, as students will actually carry out actions on the network and provide annotated screenshots. And students will need internet access as well for this task, but it's only going to be for the requirements of the brief. So maybe it's downloading software or maybe updating drivers, whatever it might be within the brief, they will need internet access, but just for those purposes. And in terms of the markers, students are getting assessed against performance outcomes 1 and 3. And just with performance outcome 3, all being about showing that critical thinking again for their security control implementations. And in performance outcome 1, students need to take those necessary steps to address the issues in the brief. Differentiate their actions depending on the type of hardware they have, such as desktop or server, and the actions being tailored accordingly, and that those security controls are effective and relevant to the brief. So just some final little preparation tips before we have another little discussion. And in terms of utilizing other resources, network cabling assignment 3 has also got a security-based risk assessment task 3 specifically. But parts of that scenario could be adapted and used with your students, so they're getting more practice, more scenarios, more different requirements, different considerations all the time. And what I've done is I've shown a screenshot of that assignment, network cabling assignment 3, where background information is given in this brief, such as the flooding risk, crime levels, the fire suppression systems they have in place. So it could be, again, useful for your students just some new context and scenarios. And not as relevant, but that assignment also has a packet tracer file that needs troubleshooting. So just in case you want a bit more practice of students with packet tracer, could be useful for that. And some of the digital support assignment 2 has also got some adaptable material. So for example, there's a help desk request in our sample assignment where it's requesting like antivirus software. So the scenario is an employee works from home, uses a USB pen, and worried one of her children's actually infected with a virus. So that could just be extended a bit more, and students could then make recommendations. Well, what are some things that could be done to better make protections here? Maybe use of encryption on the USB, or switching from how she has to carry in her work to cloud-based storage, things like that. So just getting to think about different considerations and justifying them. And just hand over to David Tin again with some final advice.
Thanks, David. Yeah, for this, I mean, same as I said with the other ones, you know, if you can get guest speakers in, if it's working with risk assessments, I'm sure you'll have all gone through it in the college where you've had to do risk assessments on things you're using and equipment you're using in the rooms. So by having people like the IT department or estates coming in talking about how they've gone through it. Alternatively, if you've still got students in placements or have done placements where they're talking to the people where they've worked, examples of risk assessments that they've got in the workplace and how they implement it so that they can feed it back to the groups to show how it might differ slightly between places. And where we'd said originally for that first assignment where I said you could get them looking round the college or your department or your floor or even just a couple of rooms, if they're looking at what security they could implement and putting together floor plans, they could then run through and look at risk assessments within that area. You know, how easy is it to access places, to access room, to work with equipment, and what measures are in place, what mitigation techniques are there. So it means that you can easily adapt it then to a scenario where they're working all the time. And I know some of the colleges are ISO compliant. So if you're ISO compliant, what would it be if you're not ISO compliant? You could have students looking at what would you need to do to comply with ISO, or even legislation, you know, what's required for GDPR and what does the college do for it and how do you tie the two together? So it means that you can kind of tie together what they've learned in the core, but also bringing it into the specialism and linking it back into that risk assessment. Thanks, David.
Excellent. Thank you, David, for that. We hope you found this training today useful for the occupational specialism assessments. And from everyone here at NCFE, we do wish you a very enjoyable and successful year.